The auditorium was silent, except for the sound of 1,000 held breaths. Names were being called, diplomas were being handed out, and somewhere in the third row, wearing a silk blouse that cost more than most people's rent, Vivian Hartwell leaned toward her new husband and said, just loud enough for the row behind her to hear, "Can you believe Marcus actually showed up? In that jacket?" She laughed. A small crystalline sound, practiced and precise. She had no idea that in 48 hours, her son's new school library would be unveiled. She had no idea whose name was engraved above the entrance. And she had no idea that the moment she had just created, that small, vicious laugh would be replayed in her memory for the rest of her life. If you've ever been the person in the room that someone underestimated out loud, this story is for you. Stay with me. And if this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that like button and subscribe, because we tell these stories with everything we have. 8 years. That is how long it had been since Marcus Hale had signed the divorce papers. 8 years since Vivian had stood in the kitchen of the home they'd shared in Portland and told him, with a kind of clinical detachment that was somehow worse than anger, that she needed someone who was going somewhere. 8 years since she had taken their son, Eli, and their mutual social circle, and the narrative, the story of what had happened, who had failed whom, and why, and shaped it entirely to her specifications. Marcus had been 34 years old when the marriage ended. He was a structural engineer, mid-level, at a firm he had joined 6 years before the divorce, earning a solid but unremarkable salary. He drove a 4-year-old Subaru. He wore functional clothes. He was not the kind of man who attracted rooms. Vivian, by contrast, had always been the kind of woman who entered spaces and rearranged them by her mere presence, sharp, beautiful, socially fluent, in ways that Marcus had always quietly admired and only later understood as a form of weaponry. The divorce was not ugly in the courtroom sense. It was ugly in the quieter, more durable sense. Vivian received primary custody of Eli, who was 9 at the time. Marcus received every other weekend, school holidays, alternating, and a child support obligation that stretched the limits of what his salary could absorb. The arrangement was legal and documented, but the atmosphere around it, the way Vivian spoke about him to Eli, to her parents, to the parents of Eli's friends, was something no court order could touch. He was characterized, in those circles, as well-meaning but limited. A man who loved his son but lacked the ambition, the resources, the vision to provide the life Eli deserved. Vivian's second husband, Jeffrey Hartwell, was an investment portfolio manager with a downtown office and a second home on the Oregon coast. Jeffrey drove a car that cost more than Marcus made in a year. Jeffrey coached Eli's lacrosse team during the years when Eli played lacrosse. Jeffrey was, in every external measurement that Vivian valued, the superior version of what Marcus was supposed to have been. Marcus knew this. He had learned, in the years after the divorce, not to fight the narrative directly. You cannot win a war of perception against someone who controls the audience. What you can do, what Marcus chose to do, was build something real, in the space where no one was watching. He had always been a structural engineer in title. What he became, in the years after the divorce, was something more specific and more significant. He had quietly pivoted his focus to sustainable infrastructure design, the architecture of public buildings, schools, libraries, community spaces, at a time when municipal governments across the Pacific Northwest were beginning to invest heavily in exactly that. He had joined a smaller, specialized firm. He had become, through patient and deliberate effort, exceptionally good at what he did, not in the way that gets announced at dinner parties, in the way that gets you called in as the lead designer when a city council is planning something they want to last 100 years. He did not tell Vivian about any of this. There was no reason to. Their communication was functional and limited. Logistics about Eli's schedule, the occasional shared expense, the civil but bloodless emails that divorce co-parenting produces. Vivian had not asked about his career in years. Why would she? She had already decided what he was. And Eli was the center of everything Marcus did and did not do. Eli, who had grown from a 9-year-old boy with a gap-toothed smile into an 18-year-old young man with his father's quiet thoughtfulness and his mother's sharp eyes. Eli, who had spent 9 years navigating the geography of 2 households, 2 value systems, and the unspoken pressure of a mother who measured love and achievement. Eli had been accepted to Whitmore University, a private institution in Seattle with a highly regarded architecture program. The acceptance had come in March. The graduation ceremony was in June. Marcus had been invited to the graduation. This was not negotiable. Vivian could not have excluded him, even if she had wanted to, because Eli had made clear that he wanted both parents present. What Vivian could control, and did, was the social architecture of the event. She and Jeffrey sat with her parents and a cluster of her closest friends in the 3rd row. Marcus had arrived alone, on purpose, without announcement, and taken a seat 3 rows behind them. He had worn a sport coat. He liked a deep charcoal herringbone that he had bought the previous spring. It was not a designer label. It was a well-made coat by a small Portland manufacturer. It fit him correctly. Vivian had spotted him during the pre-ceremony mingling. She had offered him a smile, the kind of smile that is technically a smile in the same way that a closed door is technically an opening, and said, "Marcus, you look exactly the same." She said it as if sameness were a diagnosis. Then Jeffrey had shaken his hand with the cheerful confidence of a man who has never felt genuinely threatened by anyone, and they had moved back to their seats, and Vivian had leaned over to say what she said. Can you believe Marcus actually showed up? In that jacket, the woman sitting behind her, a college friend of Vivian's named Sandra, who was attending as a courtesy, heard it. The man next to Sandra heard it. The sound carried farther than Vivian had calculated, and 2 rows back, Marcus heard it too. He sat very still for a moment. He looked at the stage where the first rows of graduates were beginning to file in. He found Eli's face in the procession, serious, proud, scanning the auditorium with the focused calm of someone trying not to be overwhelmed. And Eli found him, and something passed between them that required no words. A small nod. A recognition, Marcus breathed. He had known this would happen in some form. He had not known the exact shape it would take, but he had understood, for years, that Vivian's sense of him had calcified into something permanent, and that it would express itself in moments exactly like this one. What he had not anticipated was that the moment would arrive 48 hours before the library dedication. The timing, he would think later, was almost architectural in its precision. The ceremony was long and beautiful in the way that graduations always are. Long because of the sheer accumulation of names, and beautiful because of what each name represents to at least one person in the room. When Eli Hale was called to the stage, Marcus rose to his feet before he'd consciously decided to, and the sound he made was not the polished applause of someone performing parental pride, but the raw, involuntary sound of a man who had driven 5 hours every other weekend for 9 years, and was watching every one of those hours justified in a single moment. He was not the loudest person in the room. He was, perhaps, the most present. After the ceremony, there was a reception in the outdoor courtyard. Vivian had organized a small dinner for, afterward, a restaurant reservation, family and close friends, and Marcus had not been included in this. He had expected as much. What he had planned, instead, was a quiet dinner with Eli the following evening, before the library dedication the morning after that. In the courtyard, Vivian held court with practiced ease. She embraced Eli with the full production warmth she was capable of when an audience was present. Jeffrey put a hand on Eli's shoulder and said something about proud moments. Vivian's mother, a small, formidable woman named Constance, who had never fully forgiven Marcus for being human, kissed her grandson's cheek and said, "You'll do remarkable things, my darling." Marcus waited at the edge of the courtyard. He did not compete for space. When the cluster around Eli thinned for a moment, he walked over, and Eli turned and hugged him. A real hug, a full-shouldered hug, the kind that takes a second to release. And Marcus held his son and said, "I am so proud of you," and meant it with every layer he had. Vivian watched this from across the courtyard. Her expression was pleasant and distant, like a woman watching a nature documentary about a species she has already categorized. Jeffrey said something in her ear, and she nodded and smiled at the correct moment, and then she turned back toward her parents, and the evening continued to its conclusion. What Vivian did not know, what no one in that courtyard knew except Marcus and Eli, was that 3 months earlier, Marcus had been named the lead design architect on the Whitmore University Community Library Expansion Project. It was a $6 million project funded jointly by the university, the city of Seattle, and a private endowment. Marcus's firm had been selected after a competitive bid process. The design had been praised in the preliminary review as a landmark achievement in sustainable civic architecture. The building was already under construction. The dedication ceremony, a soft opening for the new East Wing, where the endowment plaque and architectural credits would be formally unveiled, was scheduled for 10 o'clock on the Saturday morning after graduation. Eli was enrolled at Whitmore. The library was Whitmore's library. Marcus had told Eli 3 months ago, the night the contract was finalized. He had called him, and Eli had laughed, a genuine, delighted sound, and said, "Dad, do you understand what this means?" And Marcus had said, "I think so." And Eli had said, "I'm going to be studying in a building you designed." And neither of them had spoken for a moment because the symmetry of it was almost too much to say out loud. They had agreed together not to tell Vivian before the graduation. Not out of cruelty, Marcus had been clear about this, and Eli had agreed with the clarity of someone who had spent 18 years learning to read both of his parents with precision. Not to humiliate her, not to ambush her, but because the graduation was Eli's day, and introducing this information before the ceremony would have made the ceremony about something else entirely, would have shifted the gravity in ways that would not have served Eli. After the dedication, Marcus would have told her in whatever way felt natural. He had not engineered the timing with malice. The timing had engineered itself. The Saturday morning arrived clear and cool, the kind of Seattle morning that apologizes for the week of rain preceding it by offering the sky at its most luminous. The Whitmore University campus was quiet at 9:30, the academic building still resting in the between-semester peace, but there was activity around the new east wing of the library, a small crowd gathering, university staff, city officials, members of the endowment committee, a few journalists from the architectural and civic press. Marcus arrived in the charcoal coat, the same one. He had chosen it deliberately, and if you are wondering whether that was a small act of private humor, the answer is yes, it was, and he permitted himself exactly that much. Ellie had told his mother about the dedication that morning at breakfast. She and Jeffrey had stayed in a hotel near campus and had included Eli in their checkout morning meal. He had said, with the careful casualness of someone who has rehearsed for a moment, "Are you coming to the library thing this morning? The new wing dedication. Dad's going to be there." Vivian had said, "Oh, I think we can swing by." She had assumed, from the way Eli described it, that it was a general university event, the kind of public ceremony that any family member of a new student might attend. She had not asked for details. She had not considered that there would be details worth asking for. She and Jeffrey arrived at 10 minutes past 10, slightly late, sliding into the back of the gathered crowd with the fluid ease of people who are accustomed to arriving after things have started. Vivian wore a dove-gray blazer. Jeffrey wore his default expression of benign, well-resourced confidence. Constance, who had extended her visit by a day, stood to their left in a camel-colored coat. The university president, a tall woman named Dr. Adaze Okonkwo, was at the podium. She was in the middle of her remarks, speaking about the library's role in the intellectual life of the campus, about the endowment that had made the expansion possible, about the vision that the design represented. Vivienne listened with half her attention, scanning the crowd, locating Eli near the front. He was standing close to the building entrance, which she thought was nice, a good spot to see the unveiling. She did not immediately locate Marcus. Then she did. He was standing near the podium, not in the crowd, near the podium, with the university president and two other individuals she didn't recognize, one of whom appeared to be a city official, based on the lanyard badge, and he was standing with the relaxed, grounded posture of someone who belongs precisely where they are standing. He was wearing the charcoal coat. He was holding a folded program. He was listening to Dr. Okonkwo with a small, contained expression that Vivienne had seen on his face before, many years ago, and had never bothered to decode. Something shifted in her chest, a small, preliminary wrongness, like a structural warning before a larger event. She looked at Eli. Eli was watching the podium with an expression she knew intimately, the expression of someone waiting for a moment they know is coming. "Doctor," Okonkwo said, "the Whitmore East Wing represents a new chapter in how we think about community learning spaces. It was designed with a philosophy that puts human connection at the center of physical space, that the building itself should be an argument for what education can be. We are deeply grateful to the Corwin Endowment for making this possible, and we are honored to recognize the man whose vision brought this building to life." She paused. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce the lead architect of the Whitmore Community Library, East Wing, Marcus Hale." The applause was genuine and warm. Marcus stepped to the podium. He thanked Dr. Okonkwo. He thanked the Corwin Endowment. He spoke for 4 minutes in the measured, precise voice of someone who has built things with both language and materials, about what it means to design a space where people come to become more than they were. He said that the highest purpose of architecture is not the building itself, but the human experience the building makes possible. He said that he had poured something personal into this one. He looked at Eli when he said that last part briefly, and Eli looked back, and the crowd saw a father and a son in a moment that no ceremony had scripted. Vivienne stood in the back of the crowd and experienced something she was wholly unprepared for. It was not a simple emotion, and it did not arrive in a simple way. It arrived in layers, the way structural damage often does. The first layer was confusion, the reordering of a reality she had believed to be fixed. The second layer was a kind of stunned recognition, not of who Marcus was, but of how comprehensively and for how long she had been wrong about it. The third layer was the memory of what she had said in the auditorium 2 days before, and the certainty arriving now with devastating completeness that Sandra had heard it, that the man next to Sandra had heard it, and that Eli. She looked at Eli's face, at his quiet, knowing expression. Eli had known about this for months. Jeffrey beside her had gone very still. He was a man who assessed situations for their financial and social implications as naturally as breathing, and he was doing that now, and the assessment was not favorable. He said nothing. There was, for once, nothing useful to say. Constance's face had taken on an expression that was almost archaeological in its revelation. It was the expression of a woman watching a story she has told herself for a decade quietly collapse. After Marcus's remarks, Dr. Okonkwo invited the assembled group to turn toward the entrance of the East Wing, where a slate panel above the main doors carried the building's formal designation. A cord was pulled. The covering fell. The lettering, carved in clean sans serif capitals into the gray stone, read Whitmore Community Library East Wing, and below, in smaller but permanent text, designed by Marcus Hale, lead architect, there it was. Not a performance. Stone. Marcus stepped back from the podium and moved through the crowd toward his son. Dentu. People spoke to him as he passed. The city official shook his hand. A woman from the endowment committee touched his arm. A younger colleague from his firm offered a quiet word. He received each of these with the same unhurried grace, the grace of someone who has been waiting a long time for the truth to simply be visible and has made peace with the waiting. He reached Eli. They stood together near the entrance in the shadow of the name above the door. Eli put his arm around his father's shoulders, a gesture that had, in recent years, required him to reach slightly up and then slightly down in that way. That means a son has grown past his father's height and said quietly, "That's your building, Dad." And Marcus said, "That's your library." The crowd continued to mill and speak and photograph the entrance. Vivian crossed the space toward them. Marcus saw her coming. He did not tense. He did not prepare a speech. He simply waited with the stillness of someone who has already won and has no interest in pressing the point. She stopped in front of him. Her composure was largely intact. It would have taken a great deal to fully fracture Vivian's composure in public, and she had been deploying it as armor for so long that it held even now. But her eyes were different. The clinical distance that had always lived in them when she looked at Marcus was gone, replaced by something rawer and less curated. She looked at him the way you look at something you have been profoundly wrong about for a very long time. "Marcus," she said. "Vivian," he said. A pause. Jeffrey had arrived at her side, half a step behind. Constance had not approached. The space around the three of them had developed the particular quality that spaces develop when people nearby sense that something private and significant is occurring. "I didn't know," Vivian said. "No," Marcus said. "You didn't." She opened her mouth, whether to explain, to apologize, to recover some ground, and then something stopped her. Perhaps it was the simplicity of his response. Perhaps it was the absence of heat in it, the lack of any appetite for her discomfort. Perhaps it was that she had been braced for a reckoning, and he was not offering her one. He was simply standing there, in the charcoal coat, in front of the building he had designed, next to their son, and there was nothing to fight. "It's beautiful," she said finally. She meant the building. She meant all of it. "Thank you," he said. He meant nothing more and nothing less than those two words. Jeffrey extended his hand. There was something genuine in it this time, the handshake of a man who is recalibrating, who is encountering a data point that his previous model had not accounted for. "Congratulations," Jeffrey said, seriously. "This is congratulations, Marcus." Marcus shook his hand. "Thank you, Jeffrey." There was nothing more to do with the moment. Marcus had not built the building to reach this point. He had not designed a library as a mechanism for exposing a woman who had underestimated him. He had designed a library because he was an architect who believed in what public spaces could do for human beings, and because he was good at it, and because the work itself was worth doing. The fact that the building now stood on the campus where his son would spend the next 4 years, with his name above the door, was not a victory he had planned. It was a consequence of simply continuing to work with excellence in a direction that mattered. But standing there, in that moment, he allowed himself a single, quiet breath that carried the weight of 8 years. The dedication concluded. The crowd dispersed gradually into the cool morning. Eli walked with his father along the path that ran the length of the new East Wing's exterior, the glass and steel and reclaimed timber of the facade catching the morning light. Eli said, "Did you see her face?" And Marcus said, "I wasn't looking at her face." And Eli, who knew his father, understood that this was completely true. In the weeks that followed, a photograph from the dedication appeared in a Seattle architecture publication. Marcus at the podium, the university president at his side, the new wing visible in the background. Ali texted it to his father with a single message, "Frame this." Marcus printed it and set it on the corner of his desk at the office, next to a photo of Eli at age 11, missing a front tooth, holding a tiny architectural model they had built together from balsa wood on a rainy Saturday. The model had been of a library, Marcus had forgotten this until Eli pointed it out 3 years later, and then they had both sat with the coincidence of it for a long, quiet moment. Vivian called Marcus 2 weeks after the dedication. He did not know she would call, and when her name appeared on his phone, he felt the familiar low-level bracing that 8 years of co-parenting with someone you no longer trust produces in your nervous system. He answered. She did not circle the subject. This surprised him. Whatever else Vivian was, she was not. When the circumstance finally forced it, a coward, she said, I want to apologize for the graduation. I said something unkind and dismissive, and I know it carried. And she paused, and he could hear her gathering something. I've been dismissive of you for a long time, not just in ways that were audible. He listened. He didn't fill the silence with reassurance or with retaliation. He let her say what she had called to say. I think I told myself a story, she continued, about who you were and what you were capable of. And I used that story to make sense of decisions I'd already made. And that wasn't fair. There was a pause, a real one, not a performance. I appreciate you saying that, Marcus said. I mean that. How long? She asked. How long have you been working on the Whitmore project? About 2 years. The firm's been doing projects like this for about 5 years. Another pause, the arithmetic of it settling. Ellie knew, she said. It was not an accusation. It was more like a recognition of what she had not been told and an implicit understanding of why. He found out the night the contract was signed, Marcus said. We decided together not to tell you before graduation, not to ruin anything. The day was his. Yes, she said. I understand that. And she did. That was perhaps the most significant thing about the conversation. She genuinely did. They spoke for a few more minutes. They spoke about Eli's start date, about the move to Seattle, about the logistics of the next phase of a child's life when that child becomes an adult and the scaffolding of custody and schedule falls away. They spoke with a civility that had been there before, but the civility was different now, less armored, less managed. Something had been released. When Marcus ended the call, he sat in his car in the parking lot outside his office and thought about what it meant to carry a truth quietly for a long time. There is a version of this story in which that choice is a form of weakness, in which a man who had been spoken about the way Marcus had been spoken about should have announced himself, should have corrected the record, should have demanded to be seen. He had never believed in that version. You cannot demand to be seen. You can only build something real and let it be visible. The library stood. It would stand for 100 years if the engineering held. Students would study in it and argue in it and fall in love in it and cry in it before exams and find the book that changes everything in it. Eli would walk past his father's name above the door, maybe every single day, for 4 years. That was not nothing. That was in fact the entirety of the point. There is something worth sitting with in this story, and I want to ask you directly. Have you ever been in a room where someone reduced you to a version of yourself that was never true? Where the story they told about you was so settled in their mind that no fact seemed capable of reaching it? Most of us have. And the question that story puts to us is always the same. What do you do with that? Do you spend your energy fighting the perception, or do you spend it building the reality? Marcus Hale did not design that library to prove a point to his ex-wife. He designed it because he was called to design it, because the work was meaningful, because it would serve real people in a real community for a very long time. The fact that it also happened to tell the truth about who he was, that was not strategy. That was integrity. Doing what integrity does when you stay with it long enough. It becomes visible, it becomes stone. It becomes the thing that stands when everything smaller has been forgotten. And the laugh in the auditorium, that small, crystalline practice laugh about the jacket, it lives now in a very different context than the one in which it was made. Not as a wound, not as a weapon, but as a reminder of how completely a person can be mistaken about another person and how gracefully it is possible to let them discover that for themselves. Eli started at Whitmore that September. On his first full day as a student, he sent his father a photograph. It was taken from below, angled upward, so that the frame caught both the entrance of the east wing and the name carved above it, and, in the very bottom corner of the image, barely in the frame, the toe of Eli's shoe. He was standing in the doorway. He was already inside. Marcus looked at that photograph for a long time. Then he set it on his desk next to the balsa wood library and the dedication podium picture, and he went back to work because there were other buildings to design, other spaces where human beings would come to learn and grow and be changed by what they found there. That was the job. That had always been the job. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below and tell me whether you believe patience, like Marcus's, is something a person is born with or something they build. I think about that question a lot. Like this video if it gave you something, subscribe if you want to stay for what comes next, because we have more stories like this one, and every single one of them is about what happens when the truth finally gets enough space to be seen. We'll see you in the next one.